You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
You might have heard about the Community Radio Plus app, but it's only when you start using it that you'll wonder how you lived without it.
You can listen to us wherever you are, at home, work, driving,
on public transport, gardening, protesting, or even in the bath.
Just search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. I've just noticed that the Anarchist World This Week will be on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. So I'm going to pre-record two programs. So, unlike many other radio stations here at Community Radio 3CR and the Community Radio Network, we will continue to discuss important issues during the so-called holiday period. Now, if you wonder what anarchy is all about, yes, it is about taking holidays, but that's a different matter. Anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve or share power, possibly through direct democratic means. It's the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Simple concepts, very hard to implement, not because of the concepts, but very hard to implement because those people who exercise power and concentrate wealth in their hands will use every means at their disposal to protect their power and wealth. All right. Now, when you see something, you really need to think about the background. Now, I've just noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed, the big news item for the day wasn't the Eureka celebrations, which were held in yesterday in Ballarat, and congratulations to all those people who turned up at the Reclaim the Radical Spirit, the Eureka Rebellion celebrations, 4 a.m. to 10 p.m. It's great to see so many people from across Australia turn up and participate in various aspects of that celebration. And if you missed this year, there's always next year. And if you want to hear the first 2 hours of the ceremony, you can do that by going to Community Radio 3CR, and you'll be able to find it on their website. So, $3 transaction fee to take out your own money from the bank. All right? This is the type of thing they use to kind of train us to accept the digital age. It's a little bit when you go into a supermarket and you're kind of forced through various decisions that are made to use a self-service exit unless you're willing to stand up for yourself and demand service. It's the same type of philosophy where you're willing, because of convenience, because you can tap your phone or a card to pay an account, you're willing to give away your information to the digital world, and you're willing to pay a little bit of a premium to the financial sector. So it's about training you. Look, I'm a great devotee of the banking system, having debts up to my eyeballs. And the great thing is that what I've noticed over the last few years is not just the massive closure of branches, but the fact that if you do, decide to go into a financial institution, the long lines, because of the dearth of tellers. And in some of these financial institutions that you walk into, you can only use digital platforms and you're pushed into those digital platforms. It's not about artificial intelligence, but it's about who's technology for. And what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 decades is that technology is being used to maximise profits at the expense of the customer and the people providing that service. That's the way technology has been manipulated. It's not that virtual platforms are a bad thing. It's the fact that what we've allowed as a society is for these virtual platforms to be controlled by private entities, a decreasing number of private entities. And the main focus of any private entity in a private investment for private profit world is to derive profits. And although you may think access to these digital portals is free, the fact is the collection of your information is the material which is then used to get you to buy more useless products. So what we're seeing, as we saw with the Industrial Revolution, what we're seeing with the digital revolution is the same concept. Use technology not to improve people's lives, not to improve people's accessibility, but entwine them into a system which they cannot pull out. That's a terrible analogy, but derive a system where they cannot function without actually participating in that system, because all available options are removed. So what we see in the majority of cases is governments standing back and allowing the private sector to do what they like. And to a significant degree, the Commonwealth banks, pushed to charge $3 for, to take out some money, cash, is a mechanism via which you dragoon people into acting in certain ways. And obviously, if you're going to take out $100,000 in cash, which I've never done, I'm sure most of you haven't done either, the fact is that $3 is nothing. But if you're on a social security system and you need to pay $3 to access, say, your pension payment, and you've got a plan, a budget, what you'll tend to do is take out all the cash at once, which, if you're in a vulnerable situation, puts you at risk of theft and violence. So this so-called $3 fee, which they want introduced, and then the rest of the banking sector will take it up depending on the reaction, is a mechanism, like robo-debt, of once again punishing those with the least, forcing them onto digital platforms, collecting their information to maximise their profits. So here at the Anarchist World this week, we attempt to look beyond the immediate story and look at the story, because you see, in every transaction, whether it's a corporate transaction or a small business transaction, there are 3 parties. There's capital, there's the workers in that organisation, and there's the customers. Now, if you provide capital to promote a business, obviously you want a return. You want a return on that capital. And the way you make a return on that capital is, as we see with Woolworths currently, is by squeezing your workers or ripping them off or dudding your customers. And that's the equation in a world where corporations have become too big to fail. That because they've become such an essential, integral part of the way we live our lives, if they fall into difficulty, we as taxpayers normally bail them out. So why do we find ourselves in this situation in the 21st century where governments, especially parliamentary democracies, seem incapable of discipline or regulating the corporate sector? And to a significant degree, this has occurred because of the lack of competition in a private investment for private profit world where corporations become bigger and bigger and there's no real competition. So why has this happened? Now let's look at the Commonwealth Bank, because they're the people in the firing line, as far as the mass media is concerned in today's virtual platforms. Why are they in the why do we find ourselves in this situation? In the 1980s, the Commonwealth Bank was formed in 1911 by one of the world's first Labor governments in order to break the financial monopoly the private sector had on providing financial services, mainly small loans. And it was almost impossible for ordinary people to get a small loan. So the idea of creating a people's bank, which is owned by the government of the day, not by the people of the day, but the government of the day, was to actually introduce competition. That's right, introduce competition into the financial sector. Now, when the Commonwealth Bank was privatised by a Labor Party, the Labor government, which had forgotten its history, in the mid-1980s, what happened is that break, that having a publicly owned institution competing with privately owned institution was removed from the marketplace. And those of you who are old enough to remember, what actually happened is that we saw this huge increase in fees and charges which are levied by banks on customers to maximise return for shareholders. Now, a lot of listeners may say, well, I'm a shareholder through my superannuation fund. Well, the fact is, you may be a shareholder through a superannuation fund, but you're not a majority shareholder. You're a pipsqueak shareholder. And if you think having shares through a superannuation fund in a privately owned corporation somehow is going to give you a wonderful old age, think again. Because I've said multiple times on this program, superannuation is the privatisation of old age. And if you had a shit life and you've worked, part-time because you've had responsibilities as far as maybe ill relatives or children, having children is concerned, you've been ripped off at work because we do have now lost the right to strike in this country, although a lot of people don't seem to understand that, and I'll explain that later on. The fact is that you're going to have a miserable old age. So the more income you make during your working life, the more goes into your superannuation fund, the greater your ability to pay, P-A-Y, for your retirement. And some of the most anxious elderly people I know, and I'm one of them, are self-funded retirees because they're wholly dependent on the gyrations in the private marketplace. There's almost 50% of every dollar which goes into a superannuation fund, goes into investing in their stocks and shares. So getting back to the original point, so the privatisation removed any real competition. Governments have said, well, what we'll do is we'll set up regulatory bodies to ensure that these privately owned corporations somehow will do the right thing, okay? They'll do the right thing by the community they service, forgetting that corporations or a business major responsibility is to create ever-increasing profits for their owners or their shareholders. That's the underlining basis of every privately owned institution in this country, and the few publicly owned institutions in this country like Australia Post, which refuses to cross-subsidise. So you've got this situation that in every sector of human activity, with increasing privatisation, whether it was the airports, whether it was the ports, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's energy production, whether it's financial institutions, and the list goes on, as soon as that entity is privatised, it allows the private sector to work at maximum speed to maximise profits for their major shareholders or their owners. Now, when governments talk about regulation, although you've got regulation on paper, what normally happens is the legislation which is passed through Parliament gives the overseeing body minimal power. And more importantly, these overseeing bodies do not have the finances in order to employ people to actually make sure that the law of the land, is followed. So you've got this cascading effect regarding privatisation, which most people never thought about. Although if you listen to Anarchist World This Week programs from decades ago, we've been talking about this now for decades. So when you see the Commonwealth Bank charging $3 for a cash transaction so you can access cash from your own account, it's a mechanism via which they attempt to change behaviour to suit their corporate digital model. What they're trying to do is put a round ball U into a square hole. And as you know, if you try to bash a round ball into a square hole, usually it's the round ball that gets damaged, not the square hole. So we really need to start discussing once again the introduction of legislation to create publicly owned entities. As I've said before, all this privatisation occurred in this country because publicly owned entities do not belong to the people. They belong to the government of the day. So the government of the day, on an ideological whim to help its mates, can and does consistently privatise important public assets to fit their ideological perspectives. And we're expected, to wear the costs. Whether it's toll roads, whether it's the increasing privatisation of the healthcare system, whether it's the privatisation of the education system, and the list goes on and on. I mean, it's too long to think about. And we have allowed this to occur. We have allowed this to occur because we have not put on public notice political representatives that we once again want a mechanism via which to put a brake on corporate greed. Because corporate greed is nothing new. And in a private investment for private profit society, corporate greed is what allows the system to flourish. And there's only so much of a pie that you can, goes round. So isn't it time that we said never again, that we don't have to rely on the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table to survive. And that's the situation we've come to. It's a little bit like the 19th century when people worked for the company store. By the time they finished the week's work, they were still indebted to the company store. And we now find ourselves in this situation. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, no, really unfortunately, in 2024, most people have given up the ghost. It's all too hard. Most young people have been incorporated into the system. And to a significant degree, that was due to the introduction of fees for tertiary education. So education became a mechanism via which to get the skills to get a job in the future, and at the same time became a millstone around the neck of that particular student. So from the word go, from the age of 17 or 18, we are saddling young people with debt. Now, if you've got rich parents, it doesn't really matter because they can just sign, they can do a digital transfer and bingo, there's your fees paid, your $250,000, for your medical degree. But the fact is, as we see in all these transactions, the major people who suffer are those on the lowest income. So it becomes more and more difficult for young people saddled with debt and the inability to actually gain a foothold in the housing market without, prostituting their lives for the next 50 years to the financial sector becomes much more difficult. But as I said before, the main problem is not what's happening. The main problem is our attitude as a people to what is happening. Because most Australians have bought this little sick pup that if we continue on the private investment for private profit model as a community, as a society, we will all benefit. Now, I'm not saying you haven't got lots of gadgets at home, which I didn't have when I was a youngster, right? You got your mobile phone, your little computer there on your mobile phone, your ability to pay your bills on your mobile phone, your ability to find out information on your mobile phone. Then you've got the monstrosity of pay TV, right? Then you've got all these sporting activities you can get involved in and jump up and down. And then you've got all, you can get a financial broker. You can invest in this, you can invest in that, you can get a little bit of Bitcoin. The fact is that society has changed. And it's changed in a way that we all have become little capitalists. We are all integrated into the system. And those who refuse to be integrated into the system are further ostracised and marginalised. Not because what they're demanding isn't important, but because it doesn't fit the corporate model about maximising profits. So instead of lamenting the fact that the Commonwealth Bank is going to introduce a $3 fee on financial transactions, isn't it about time to put pressure on governments to say, what about creating new public entities in education, free up tertiary education, in the financial sector, create a new People's Bank. But this time, unlike 1911, let's put this question to the people in a referendum. Because the only way to prevent privatisation of essential public instruments which acted as a mechanism via which to control an unregulated private sector is to incorporate its ownership in the Australian Constitution. And I can assure you, I've had discussions with hundreds, if not thousands, of people over the last 50 years regarding this very issue, that if such a question was put to the people in a referendum, it would be passed tomorrow. Because most people understand, because of their personal experiences with financial institutions and privately owned corporations which provide essential services, that any possibility of receiving any justice is minimal or non-existent under the current arrangements. So the fact is, we've bought this sick little pup and we've watched it, fade away. And it's about to die. And we're going to bury it. We're going to bury this privatisation nightmare. We are going to demand, and it's very simple to demand. You don't have to go out in the streets and the protests. If you're a computer warrior, you're internet warrior, get out there. Bombard your local politicians. There's a federal election coming round the corner in 4 or 5 months' time. Demand a meeting with your local representative regarding these very issues. Ask them why they're not talking about creating new public institutions to act as a competitive force against a corporate sector which seems to be able to do whatever it likes whenever it likes because of the lack of regulation and the lack of authorities which can actually have any impact on their behaviour. We've seen this begin. There is a little beginning. There is a little flicker. There's a little bit of hope. But I keep saying, hope is the love child of desire and expectation. The desire for change and the expectation that change will occur. But desire and expectation ultimately gets you nowhere. You need desire for change, expectation that it will occur, and action to ensure that it will occur. Now, if you're interested in those ideas and you're interested in joining particular organisations, I recommend Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. You can join online, pibci, pibci.net. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Welcome to all our listeners across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. The program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. My name's Joseph Toscano. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Now, I've noticed a little bit of gloom, Gloom, in the activist community. I mean, a little bit of gloom, as if the end is nigh. Well, the end isn't nigh. Human beings, for thousands of years, have coped with a myriad of disasters. We may be in for a difficult time as the ideological and political situation changes around the world, as we spend more and more time looking at political and social movements and economic movements which divide us. That's right, divide us. Sometimes in the most flimsy of circumstances. Clothes we wear, whether we wear funny hats, whether we have tattoos, whether the colour of our skin is not quite right. Maybe it's our gender, sexual orientation, language we speak, where we come from. There's a myriad of ways by which to divide people. And divide and conquer has always been a very, very important political strategy in terms of creating an environment which allows those who dominate that environment politically and financially to continue to dominate that environment. And you usually find in a period of increasing stress that we tend to look around for easy solutions, and we see people around the world looking for easy solutions. We see demagogues being able to use that despair to promote themselves at the expense of the people. You really have to wonder when people believe that a billionaire rapist surrounded by billionaires is somehow going to improve their social situation. And that somehow, by ostracising and marginalising elements of your own community, that somehow things will improve. And we see this around the world. We see nationalism being used as a force for evil. Let's not forget the Nazi Party's program was National Socialism. National Socialism. Nationalism. You know, we see the rise and rise of nationalism. I was particularly disgusted a few weeks ago on the 11th of November during Remembrance Day to see all these ceremonies around this country talking about Australia's sacrifice. Remembrance Day is not about Australia's sacrifice. It's about remembering those who died in war around the world, the winners, the losers, the workers at either end of a bayonet, fighting for the glory of God, king or country. That's what it's not about. Anzac Day is about remembering Australia's war dead. But that's a different story. So, what happens during this period is we turn on each other. Whether we're in organisations where we tend to have esoteric arguments about unimportant differences, leading to the breaking down of those organisations, creating despair and disillusionment amongst people who've joined those organisations in order to improve the situation. So that's one thing we need to guard against. In a period where you're bunkered down and you're trying to survive in terms of your ideas and the spreading of those ideas, it's important to maintain that cohesion and not see your allies or potential allies as your main threat. Because when that happens, any progress comes to a halt, because those sections of society that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication continue to grow at our expense because of the lack of resistance in our community to the private investment of the private profit mantra. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Just like to remind you about the Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner Commemoration here in Melbourne on the 20th of January, midday the 20th of January 2025. So what am I talking about? Why does it matter 183 years later? Who are Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner? Well, after a 10-year struggle, which was initiated by the Anarchist Media Institute, we were able to force the city of Melbourne to erect a significant monument to Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner, who were two Tasmanian First Nations people who were first people hung in Melbourne on the 20th of January in a public execution, 1842, for having the audacity to resist white colonisation. 5 people of the 82 survivors of the Tasmanian Holocaust who found themselves on Flinders Island in 1839, 17 were brought across to Victoria to civilise the Victorian blacks by Mr. Robertson, who had been congratulated for eradicating the pests who'd lived on, Tasmania for tens of thousands of years, because once they'd been expelled to Flinders Island, property prices doubled. Excitement. So Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner, Putirana, Truganini and Planobina, 5 survivors, had been brought to Melbourne, whose rations had been stopped, took to the Mornington Peninsula and the Dandenongs, and began a campaign of armed resistance. Considering what they'd been through, this armed resistance was particularly, how shall I put it, moral, ethical. Women and children were spared. Their main aim was to burn down the colonialist dwellings outside of Melbourne to force them back into Melbourne. Eventually, this rebellion, which caused consternation amongst the 8,000 people living in Melbourne at that particular point in time, consternation came to an end when they were arrested after hundreds of shots were fired into their campsite on the Mornington Peninsula on the 20th of November 1841. Brought before a court, the 2 men were sentenced to hang for resisting white colonisation. What had been an underground war, an undeclared war, where over 100,000 Indigenous people had been living in Victoria for over 60,000 years, and been reduced from over 100,000 to 2,000 within 20 years. The colonisation began. Disease, shootings, massacres, so we could grow some sheep, to get some wool, to send to the industrial complexes in England. And they were publicly executed. Not poisoned, not hacked to death, not starved, but publicly executed by the British authorities for resisting that colonisation process. There's a lot of information about Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner these days on the net. I'm sure you can find it. But the important thing is, after a 10-year struggle, which began in 2006, this major monument was erected at the corner of Victoria Street and Franklin Street. It's still there. Native trees and grasses surround the monument. It's a play on execution at the site it occurred, where you've got what seems to be a swing, but when you really look at it, it's basically a hanging platform. So I invite you, on the 20th of January at midday, every year since 2006, we've been gathering on that spot. There were a number of speakers, mainly First Nations people, speaking about why it matters 183 years later, because in many regards, little has changed in 183 years. So I invite you to take the day off, bring the children, the grandchildren. It's a peaceful event. There's a 1-hour commemoration at the monument site at the corner of Franklin Street and Victoria Parade. And after that, we march or walk silently to what we believe is their burial spot in the Queen Victoria Markets. So put it in your calendar. It's the next big event. Hopefully, as many of you as possible can attend, and you can bring your children so that they get an understanding of the type of society we were and the fact that we've never really acknowledged that past. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. And there's no more vociferous opponent to First Nations people improving their situation than the National Party of Australia. Because they, in a significant number, are the descendants of the original squatters that took away that land. Once again, let's move on. So, Gaza. You know, it may have fallen off the news cycle, Gaza. And we've got the situation in Syria, where we've seen one particular group being able to move forward against the Assad forces, which have been supported by military dictatorships. Now, I'm quite certain, and theocracies, I'm quite certain that the Israeli government doesn't want to see the destruction of the Assad government, because Syria has a border with Israel. It's a relatively quiet border, because Mr. Assad and his government have understood, in order to survive, they need to be nice to the Israeli government. And I'm sure the Israeli government would be very upset if a more radical force with a more independent views regarding the situation in Syria gained power in Damascus right up to the Israeli border. You'd see another situation arise, as we see with the Lebanese-Israeli border. But I can talk generally, but that's not the point. We are witnesses, you and me, courtesy of the digital revolution. We are witnesses to atrocities, unparalleled pain and suffering in the 21st century that we never expected to see. The damage caused by the Russians in the Ukraine, compared to the obliteration of any physical and institutional structures which existed in Gaza before the Israeli invasion, is extraordinary. A direct death toll of over 44.5 kilometres. 44,500 people, I should say. And the reason I made that slip of the tongue is very simple, because from the very beginning I've been saying to people and listeners to the Anarchist World this week, if you really want to understand the enormity of the carnage that's occurring, directly and indirectly, maybe almost 45,000 people have died directly, tens of thousands have been injured, hundreds of thousands have died because of the lack of access to basic services and disease. Let's not forget that. There's already been articles in respected medical journals regarding about the so-called collateral damage to this invasion. And the fact is, Gaza isn't the Ukraine, this huge country. Gaza is a little area about half the size of Melbourne, about the size of Canberra. And 14 months later, we still continue to see these atrocities. And as I said before, it's easy to, tell you numbers. 44,500, 17,000 of them are children. I could say, so many children have been bombed to bits, one every 30 seconds or whatever, one every 30 minutes. But that means nothing. You can look at the suffering on the virtual world on various digital platforms. And in many regards, we get used to this. We become dehumanised. We accept this as the reality. And the fact is that what Israel has done could not have been done without the support of the United States government. Is something that we need always to keep in the back of our minds. But I think one simple way, which I've talked about ad nauseum on this program over the last, 14 months, of actually understanding the scale and the depth of the carnage, the human suffering and the death toll, is once the program is finished, or maybe tomorrow when you've got a spare day or on the weekend, I encourage you to go on a 44.5 kilometre walk. It's a long walk, much longer than a marathon these days. And as you're walking, have a look on the side of the road. And on every metre, there's a body. Every metre. Men, women, children. The majority women and children. And elderly. Every metre there's a mutilated body. As you're walking those 44 44.5 kilometres. And that'll give you a real physical sense of the enormity of the barbarism we are seeing in Gaza, irrespective of what Hamas did. And Hamas is just a political organisation. Irrespective. The carnage that has occurred post the 7th of October is something that would not have even been acceptable in many parts of the world in the 19th century. In the 21st century, the digital age, it's totally acceptable. 44.5 kilometre walk. Every metre of the body of somebody who's been a Palestinian from Gaza, who's been directly killed as a result of the Israeli levelling of that area, pocket of the earth, one of the most densely populated pockets of the earth. And let's not forget, history didn't begin on the 7th of October. In many ways, it reminds me of Australia. You know, we tend to think that history began on the 26th of January, 1788. Anything that occurred before that is irrelevant. And it's the same in Israel. The Palestinian struggle didn't begin on the 7th of October, 2023. It began 70 years earlier. The fact that Gaza had been a virtual prison for 16 years since Hamas was elected as their political representatives by the people of Gaza, the fact that life was intolerable before the invasion seems to have somehow no longer be news. So that's the thing about life. There's a before and there's an after. It's not just living in the moment. That's the biggest load of codwallop shit that I've ever heard. And I usually laugh when people tell me, I'm living in the moment. And what a load of crap. There's a before, there's an after. There are consequences. So go on that walk. And remember, you're not being bombed while you're going on that walk. And take a bottle of water with you, or a few bottles. 44.5 kilometres is a very long walk. Try it. And through the corner of your eyes, there's a body every metre. Men, women, children, elderly. Mainly women, children and the elderly. You know, they're collateral damage, aren't they? Collateral damage. What a wonderful word. What a wonderful word. You're listening to the Anarchist World this week. Now, Christmas is coming and we've had the Black Friday sale. I don't know what the Black Friday sales are. I assume it's crappy shit you buy because you've got a bit of extra cash and you think you're going to get a bargain. But isn't it interesting how everything is monetarised in a capitalist society, in a private investment for private profit world? Everything has a monetary value. A banana stuck on a wall with a bit of duct tape, $9.5 million. Bradman's cap, $500,000. Everything is monetarised. Human relationships are monetarised. Everything is monetarised. It's all about making a buck. What a world do we live in? I mean, I know there were, in the Bible, it said, you know, that Christ kicked over the tables of the moneylenders in the temple. And that they were concerned that people were worshipping Mammon. You see, the trouble is in 2024, if Christ came here and he started kicking over the money tables, he started kicking try to kick in a window with a sledgehammer of a financial institution that ripped you off, most likely you'd be shot by the police because you've got a sledgehammer in your hand. And if you weren't resurrected, you'd be in big trouble, wouldn't you? So, monetarisation, every human interaction depends on money. Put your plastic fantastic in the drawer. take out any cash you got out of your wallet and go out there for 2 or 3 days and try to survive and see what happens. You'll begin to understand what the monetarisation of everything, every human interaction means. And by you showing humanity to another human being and being involved in interaction that doesn't require an exchange of money for a goods or service, what you are doing is you are reclaiming your birthright, a birthright to be part and parcel of a society, a community, a birthright to be able to live from a fear of freedom. And for far too long, most Australians have been too tired, too frightened to say anything, hoping against hope that they keep their heads under the parapet that nothing will happen. And that's why things happen, because we allow them to happen. We refuse, as individuals, as communities, to fight back. Of all times, now's the time not to lose hope. Now's the time to fight back. Finally, a little question, trick question. I've been thinking about this morning, today, depending when you hear the program. And a little question. What are the parallels between the attempted imposition of martial law in South Korea yesterday? That's, 3rd of December 2024, Eureka Day, and the dismissal of the Australian Labor government in 1975. There's huge parallels when you think about it. The fact is that in 1975, somebody who'd been appointed by Her Highness was able to legally, in inverted commas, dismiss a government that had been elected by the Australian people before the next election was due. So the whole process of going through a parliamentary sham, the whole process of going through the parliamentary system in 1975, the 11th of November 1975, was shown to be a sham, that real power didn't lie in the hands of the people, but it lied in superimposed structures which represented the Crown or a different entity. Now, Gough Whitlam, and a lot of people criticise him for this, accepted the fact that his government had been dismissed, and within 12 hours of that dismissal, the Labor Party was asking people to calm down, not to protest, because there was a potential. There was a potential for civil war. There was that potential. I was part of it in 75. There was that potential on the streets. South Korea, 3rd December 2024. Martial law is declared, not because of some impending threat from North Korea, but because of an impasse in the South Korean government, in the parliament. Just like in 1975, where there was an impasse in the Labor Party, an impasse in the Australian Parliament. So, living in a parliamentary democracy is a day-to-day proposition, because mechanisms can be put in place which dismiss governments outright, irrespective of the wishes of the people. You've been listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, regular listeners, a few dates you may be interested. Unfortunately, it's all in Melbourne, but maybe you're coming down for a holiday. Next Wednesday, that's the 11th of November, encouraging people to join us for an end-of-year gathering at the Alicia Restaurant at the corner of Hope Street and Sydney Road in Brunswick, 6 p.m. start. We've got a big picnic on the 19th of December in the Parliamentary Gardens. Where else? The corner of Lonsdale Street and Spring Street, starting at midday to 3 p.m, to which you're invited to bring food and drinks, bring yourself, bring a musical instrument, bring a politically motivated T-shirt. Who knows? Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of those wonderful people on the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. You can leave nice messages on 0439 395 489. You can go to tons of web garbage. It's up to you. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
3CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call us on 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.